Clear prop.
Star 73, Yankee number 2, following twin traffic, 3 mile final, clear Sutton. 1 Charlie Bravo, exit in runway 25, going 4 mile final.
This is Behind the Prop with United Flight Systems owner and licensed pilot Bobby Doss and his co-host, Major Airline Captain and Designated Pilot Examiner Wally Mulhern. Now let's go Behind the Prop.
What's up, Wally?
Hey, Bobby, how are you?
I'm great. We have another special guest today. I think one that you wanted to join the show for many months, and we got in touch, and he was very responsive. We have Mike Busch on the show today from Savvy Aviation. Mike, thanks for joining us.
Oh, you bet. Glad to do it.
So, obviously, maintenance is a big part of my life. Wally being an airline captain and a designated pilot examiner, he deals with maintenance and logbooks on a daily basis as well. Mike, you've done a lot of things, from your podcast on the AOPA, Ask the AMPs, and obviously joining us today, and many, many things on the web that you have helped pilots, and not to mention your books. We're going to jump into a lot of topics today, but you have 4 books today. Manifesto, I believe, was your first book. Is that correct?
Yes, that was my first book. Came out in 2014.
And then Engines, and then Aircraft Ownership, Volume 1 and 2. Invaluable books for any aircraft owner, for sure, or flight school owner.
It was originally supposed to be a series of 3 books, but when I got into doing the ownership book, it became clear after we outlined it that it was going to be 1,000 pages, and you can't practically do a 1,000-page paperback. It just doesn't work.
No.
So it wound up being a 2-volume set on the ownership book.
Well, thanks for the work that you do. Thanks for what you share with aviation. I think we're going to try and focus on a couple topics and keep this to 35 minutes or so. But I've paid a lot of attention to your leaning stuff online. I've been re-listening the last couple of days. I think as a flight school owner, I spend a lot of money on mag checks that don't go well. People coming back and the debate whether they should lean or not lean. I've listened to it. What's your opinion on leaning Lycoming 4-cylinder engines, Mike?
Well, there's very good reasons for leaning any engine aggressively, but with the 4-cylinder Likes, we have a particular problem when you don't lean aggressively because they're very vulnerable to sticking valves, and the reason that the valves stick is because the combustion temperatures aren't high enough if people aren't leaning aggressively, particularly during ground operations, a taxi, idle, run up, that sort of thing. An awful lot of people taxi these airplanes around with the mixture control shoved all the way in, do the run up full rich. That's very bad for the engine. And what happens is that if the combustion temperatures aren't high enough, then the lead scavenging agent that's blended into 100 low lead, ethylene dibromide, can't do its job of scavenging the lead. The avgas has a lot of tetraethyl lead as an octane enhancer blended into it. And during combustion, that lead wants to turn into metallic lead. And there's a lead scavenging agent in the fuel whose job it is to turn it into a gas so that it escapes out the exhaust instead of making deposits inside the combustion chamber. But for that scavenging to work, the combustion temperatures have to be fairly high. And if they aren't, then metallic lead will precipitate out on spark plugs, which can cause spark plug fouling. But more seriously, deposits of lead salts start forming on the exhaust valve stem. And the more deposits build up, the harder it is for the valve to close, because the deposits, kind of foul up the valve guide. And so Lycomings are particularly vulnerable to valve sticking. And initially it exhibits itself in the form of what we call morning sickness, where the engine runs real rough when it's first start of the day when everything's cold. And that happens because one or more of the cylinders is not lighting off initially, because the exhaust valve is stuck open and won't close. And then as the engine warms up, the clearances get a little looser and the valve starts working properly. But if that symptom is ignored and things progress further, you can get to the point where the valve sticks in flight, or sticks when the engine's under power. We've seen quite a few valve strikes where the valve doesn't close, the piston comes up and actually contacts the valve, and you can see either a circular pattern on the top of the piston if it's a parallel valve engine, or a semicircular pattern if it's an angle valve engine on the top of the piston if you stick a borescope in the cylinder, because the piston actually wound up hitting the valve because the valve didn't close before the piston got to top dead center. So it's a pretty serious problem with Lycomings, and it's caused forced landings and worse.
Well, it causes me a lot of inspections by my local mechanic because it's a fouled plug in most cases for us, and it is that lead that's leaving deposits on the spark plug most of the time, and it can't be cleaned.
Against that is aggressive leaning, and it's particularly important during ground operations, and that's really not taught a lot. When most pilots, when they're taught to lean, it's in the context of flying the airplane, but it's often a subject that's not covered in flight instruction about leaning on the ground. But that's particularly important with the small Lycoming engines, to lean aggressively on the ground. The engines are set up so that when the mixture is full rich, it's god awful rich. It's way too rich, and the reason for that is because the engines need a very, very rich mixture in order to be able to start. If you think about it, well, say your lawnmower, it typically has a choke on it, and you have to turn the choke on to start the engine to give it an extra rich mixture. But once the engine starts running, you need to turn the choke off, or the poor engine is going to be belching black smoke out the exhaust because it's running so rich. Well, airplane engines don't have a choke. They just have a mixture control that, when it's full rich, creates this ultra rich mixture that's needed for cold starts. But then once the engine starts and it warms up a little bit, the mixture control has to come out to get the mixture to something more reasonable. Otherwise, the combustion is going to be extremely dirty, and it's going to start building up all these deposits that we really don't want to have happen, that cause lots of mischief.
And I think I've heard here that we're at sea level, so we should stay full rich. A POH written 50 years ago says we should, and that's part of the debate. I like you using the word aggressively leaning. What to you would be aggressive, and how would you tell a newer flight instructor who's going to meet dozens and dozens of students over the next couple of years how to teach aggressively leaning the aircraft on the ground?
Well, there's two possible answers to that. That at the very minimum, the engine ought to be leaned to best power mixture for operations on the ground. And the way you lean to best power mixture is very simple. You lean for maximum RPM. If the mixture is full rich and the carburetor is set up correctly, if this is a carbureted engine, or the fuel injection system is set up correctly if it's an injected engine. But if the system is set up correctly, then once the engine warms up, as you lean the engine, if you watch the tachometer, you will see a small RPM rise as you pull the mixture out. And the RPM will reach a peak point, And then if you keep pulling it out further, then the RPM will start to decrease and the engine will start to run rough and sort of threaten to quit. And the peak RPM point is best power mixture. So at the very least, the engine should be leaned for that peak RPM point. Now, personally, I like to lean a little bit more aggressively than that. And when I say that, I like to lean as far as I can without the engine stumbling at throttle up. And that's what I would call an aggressively lean mixture for ground operations. But at the very least, the engine should be leaned for best power mixture, which is the maximum RPM point. And by the way, the amount of RPM rise that you get when you do that, when you take the mixture control from full rich to the peak RPM point, tells you whether the idle mixture is set up correctly on the carburetor. There's an idle mixture adjustment on the carburetor, it's a little needle valve. And if it's set up properly with a warm engine, you should get about a 50 RPM rise as you lean. If you get much more than that, say 150 RPM rise, then the idle mixture is set too rich and it needs to be adjusted. And if you get, say, less than a 25 RPM rise or no rise at all, then the idle mixture is adjusted too lean. Either way, it's just a simple little screwdriver adjustment on the carburetor to get that set up correctly. But if it's set up properly, typically you'll get roughly a 50 RPM rise as you lean. And it's at that maximum RPM point that you ought to be operating the engine while you're taxiing around or doing the run up. Then you've got to remember to go back to full rich for takeoff. But then once you start the climb and the power starts reducing, you need this extra super rich mixture in two different situations. You need it for starting the engine cold. It's like pulling out the choke. And you also need it for 100% power operation to get adequate detonation margins when the engine is operating at 100% power, which it only is doing that at takeoff. Then as you climb, Mother Nature is throttling the engine back, even if the pilot isn't doing that. And once the power gets down to say 80% power, you don't need that super rich mixture anymore. You can lean it appropriately.
And so I think the debate has also been during run up. Every checklist says go full rich beforehand, but I do think that it makes a lot of sense after listening to your webinars multiple times on why to stay leaned during that run up. And just make sure you go full power.
Embry-Riddle had a very interesting experience. This was back in, I guess, the late 90s, I think. I'd have to look up to see exactly when it was. But, Embry-Riddle runs the world's largest flight school in Florida, and they've got this huge number of airplanes on the line. And they had replaced all of their old 150s and 172s with new 172 Rs, I think, Rs or S's, that had the injected 4-cylinder Lycoming engines. And they started having tons of problems with these engines, running rough and hard starting and all sorts of issues. And the problems got so bad that they wound up grounding their fleet and calling Lycoming, and a big Tiger team from Lycoming and from Cessna came down to Florida to try to see what was going wrong with this brand new fleet of airplanes at Embry-Riddle. And what they determined was that the problems were all being caused by the airplanes running way too rich. At that time, Embry-Riddle was teaching sort of the old traditional don't touch the mixture control unless you're above 5,000 feet kind of thing. And they were just, the poor engines were just suffering very, very badly, to the point, like I said, where they grounded the fleet because they were getting so many squawks about rough running, power interruptions, hard starting, all sorts of things. And as a result, Lycoming issued a service bulletin talking about the importance of leaning on the ground, and Cessna actually revised the POH for those late model 172s. But of course, they didn't revise the POHs for the old legacy 172s. But all of these Lycoming engines have the same issues. And it's not just Lycomings, but the Lycomings suffer more from the sticking valve problems than Continentals do. And it's because of the sodium-filled exhaust valves that the Lycomings use. One of the things that I'm a very big advocate for is doing borescope inspections. It seems to me, any time a spark plug comes out of an engine, it's almost criminal not to stick a borescope in and take a look around through the spark plug hole. And when you borescope an engine, you can instantly see whether the pilots have been leaning it properly, because you'll either see a nice clean combustion chamber, or you'll see a mess of lead deposits. And it tends to be much worse in Lycomings than it does in Continentals, in terms of the lead deposits that you see if the engines aren't leaned properly. So the leaning is even more important if you're operating a Lycoming.
Well, those are all good tips. Wally, any questions as it relates to leaning?
No, it's great to hear all this, Mike. I have two airplanes, both with Lycomings themselves, so I'm taking notes here. But I'm like you. I was brought up in the time where you don't touch the mixture control below 5,000 feet, and it's a totally different philosophy.
And I can appreciate the fact that when you're a flight instructor, which I am, and you're training a primary student, you want to make things as simple for the student as possible. You don't want to complicate his life, because he's, it's taking 100% of his attention just to keep the dirty side down. Right. And so, it's kind of like, well, we'll get to that red knob later. It tends to be the philosophy during primary instruction. And right. As a flight instructor, the law of primacy, which is that the way you're taught first is the way you always you remember. So if somebody teaches you a bad habit, that bad habit's probably going to persist, as long as you're flying. It's very much harder to correct a bad habit than to teach it right in the first place. But this business about let's not worry about the mixture control is really teaching student pilots bad habits that will often persist in their flying after they, become aircraft owners and are flying elaborate equipment, maybe a high performance turbocharged single engine airplane, and they're still saying, "Oh, I'm not going to touch the red knob until I get above 5,000 feet." That's really bad. So I think we need to teach pilots to do this correctly from the get-go.
Well, and around the flight school, we ran all our aircraft wet, and I think Wally and I have both heard students say, "Well, I'm not paying for the fuel. I don't care if I lean it because I'm not worried about it." But it's not about saving fuel; it's about saving the cylinders in the engine. Right.
The fuel economy is a secondary thing, and the fuel economy is important if you're doing, long cross countries where your range is critical. But, for flight training, the important thing is keeping the engines running reliably. And improper leaning is a good way to cause the engines not to run reliably and have lots of squawks and stuff.
And that is a world that I live in, unfortunately. Speaking of running reliably, let's talk a little bit about TBO, time between overhaul, and everybody has got an opinion. This might be a little controversial to our listeners, but this 2,200 hour number of tack time on an engine, that it should be overhauled. How do you feel about that, Mike?
Well, it's funny you mentioned this. Because I was just this morning proofreading the final layout of my AOPA pilot column that I think is going to be in the June issue. That talks about a TBO, and the experiences that I went through personally that convinced me that TBO is something that is best completely ignored. TBO is a funny concept. The FAA requires engine manufacturers to publish a TBO for their engines, and then the FAA does not require operators to comply with the TBO. But an awful lot of aircraft owners and an awful lot of mechanics start getting nervous, as the takt time approaches that magic number. And, an incalculable number of perfectly healthy engines have been voluntarily euthanized just because the takt said, 1,500 hours or 2,000 hours or whatever the TBO number is. And that's really insane. I kind of learned about TBO personally. When I bought my current airplane, which is a Cessna Turbo 310, I bought it in 1987, and I bought it with 1,300 hours on the engines, and the engines were rated at a 1,400 hour TBO. And this was 1987. This was long before I was an A&P mechanic or anything. I was just an appliance operator back then. And so it didn't take me very long to get to 1,400 hour TBO. So I talked to a bunch of friends of mine who were veteran A&Ps. And I said, I'm at TBO. The engine seemed to be running fine. What do you recommend that I do? And the recommendation was unanimous. They said, well, as long as the engines are healthy, go ahead, keep flying them. So I did that. And then eventually I got to 500 hours past TBO. And I started getting nervous because I realized that I was like operating on borrowed time or something like that. So when I got to 500 hours over TBO, I just decided that's as far as I want to go with these engines. And so I pulled them and sent them to a very good engine shop in Southern California. And I called the owner of the shop and I said, I'm sending you these two TSI 0520 engines, and I'd like you to tear them down and measure them. But before you start putting them back together, I'd like you to give me a call because I'd like to come down to the shop and like survey the damage and see what these engines looked like at 500 hours over TBO. So a few weeks later, he called me and he said, okay, your engines are all in pieces on a couple of engine carts, and this would be a good time for you to come down and visit. So I did that. And he walked through the engines with me, and I was totally astonished by what I saw. And what I saw was the bottom ends of the engines were absolutely pristine. The crankshafts were perfect. The camshafts were perfect. The bearings looked like they had hardly any wear on them. The cylinders were all within 1,000th of an inch of new limits in all dimensions. The valve guides were kind of out of tolerance. There were some, basically the valve guides being out of tolerance was the only thing that we found that really needed anything. So we put the engines back together, had them put the engines back together with all of the same cylinders. We just revalved the cylinders. And of course, new bearings and stuff because the engine was all apart. And sent them back to me with a nice big invoice. And I vowed to myself, self, you are never going to tear down a perfectly healthy engine again. That's it. I'm going to fly these engines until they start talking to me. So I flew those overhauled engines until they reached TBO again, 1,400 hours since major overhaul, and they were doing just great. And I kept flying them, and I got to twice TBO, 2,800 hours since major overhaul, and they were still doing great. And so I kept flying them, and I flew them until they got to 3,300 hours since major overhaul. And keep in mind that when the engines were overhauled, the same cylinders went back on. So the cylinders, by this time had like 5,000 hours on it.
Wow.
And at that point, I had a freak fatigue failure of one of the pistons in the right engine that caused the piston to shed about half of the piston skirt, which is the very, very bottom part of the piston below the scraper ring. It just fractured off and fell into the sump. It fought with the crankshaft on the way down, so it wound up getting into the sump as a whole bunch of marble-sized aluminum chunks. The engine continued to run just fine. I was at 11,000 feet flying over the Nevada desert. I was actually on my way to Oshkosh for AirVenture when this happened. The engine kept running fine. It was making power. It remarkably wasn't shaking or anything noticeably. After I saw what the piston looked like, I was astonished at that, because that piston must have been way out of balance when it shed that piece of skirt. And I actually considered, well, at any rate, I made a precautionary landing at North Las Vegas and continued my flight to Oshkosh on the airlines from out of Las Vegas. After we finally figured out what happened, that this piston, had this weird failure. I actually considered just cleaning all of the aluminum crap out of the sump and continue to run the engines, but I kind of decided, nah, this is probably time. It's 3,300 hours since major overhaul, 5,000 hours on most of the cylinders. I think it's probably time to overhaul the engine. So I did. The left engine, which was also at 3,300 hours and 5,000 hours on the cylinders, obviously wasn't contaminated, hadn't had any failures. So as a compromise, I decided on the left engine, I was going to do a top overhaul. I was going to change all the cylinders out and all the pistons out. Because the left engine was overhauled at the same time as the right engine. So it had 6 pistons out of the same batch of pistons as the one that had the failure. So I thought it would probably be a good idea to get rid of those pistons. And while the cylinders were off, I had the connecting rods rebushed and the connecting rod bearings changed, but the engine never came out of the airplane. The case has never been split. And that was 5 years ago, and that left engine is still doing just fine. So that was sort of my TBO experience. And then I had a good friend who bought one of the very early Cirruses, and that the Cirruses were powered by a Continental IO 550N engine, and when he got to 2,000 hours, we had a conversation, and I convinced him to keep on flying. And so it was kind of a long story. I won't go into it, but at any rate, he flew that engine to 3,500 hours, and then started seeing a little bit of material in the oil filter, which I had him send out to a lab for scanning electron microscopy, and it turned out to be identified as a bronze alloy that was bearing material. So I told him that, based on what was in his filter, one of his main or rod bearings was starting to come apart. So this was 3,500 hours on the engine. He decided to overhaul it, and he indeed found one half of the number one main bearing had started to shed some metal. Interestingly, the opposite half of that same bearing looked fine, and all the other bearings in the engine looked fine. But so that approach, I think, is the approach that I now recommend. That just fly the engine until it starts talking to you. If you do that, of course, you have an obligation to be listening.
Yes.
So it's really, really important to do oil filter inspections, to send out oil for spectrographic analysis, to do borescope inspections, all of the modern tools that we have for monitoring engine condition. But if you do that, I'm convinced that that the engine will tell you when it's time to take it apart.
Yeah, and I think there's a religion around TBO, as I'm sure you're fully aware. And I think that we do every 50 hour an oil change on our aircraft, and I think we're definitely listening. And my mechanic does a really good job of taking care of us. I think we fly them, and when it gets to that 3,000 hour mark, everybody starts asking questions, and we just start listening harder, like you said.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen the small 4-cylinder likes, particularly in flight school operations. I mean, if you're using them in a flight school where they're flying, every day, they're the poster children for going past TBO. They're just in optimum condition, because typically when engines start running into trouble, before TBO, it's because they've been sitting and because they've been allowed to corrode inside. I mean, the biggest problem that we have, particularly with Lycoming engines, is the cam and lifter coming apart, and that's because the engines aren't flying often enough. But in a flight school operation where you're flying the engines just about every day, I've seen the small cylinder likes in flight schools go to 4,000 or 5,000 hours before they had any problems, and often they'll go that far and never even have a cylinder off.
I've heard that too, and we don't sit much. We have a very busy fleet.
Fly them a lot and lean them aggressively, and they'll last a long time.
Well beyond this TBO number. I like that. Man, we've gone 33 minutes. I want to keep talking. Maybe we have to do a part 2 one day, but I did want to highlight what I read about, what I know Wally uses, and that's your company, Savvy Aviation's engine monitoring data analysis that you guys do. How valuable is that to an engine owner when you guys go through that engine analysis, the data on that engine?
I think engine monitor data analysis is extremely important, and it's useful to think of the engines as being 2 parts, a hot section and a cold section, to use turbine terminology. And the condition of the cold section, the bottom end of the engine, the main bearings, rod bearings, all that kind of stuff, the best tool we have for monitoring that condition is oil filter inspection. And it's very, very important. If I ever go to a shop and look in the trash can and see an oil filter that hasn't been cut open, that's a really bad sign. And the best tool we have for determining the condition of the top end of the engine is engine monitor analysis and borescope inspections. Both very, very valuable tools. It's really unfortunate that a lot of mechanics still don't do regular borescope inspections. I think anytime a spark plug comes out of a cylinder, it's almost criminal not to stick a borescope in the spark plug hole and look around and see what's going on inside. But that's very frequently something that's not done. And the other thing is engine monitor data analysis. And the advantage of engine monitor data analysis is the engine monitor is monitoring that engine continuously all the time, whereas borescope inspections at best are typically done once a year at annual. And a lot of the times they're not even done at annual. The very common practice that we see in the field now is a mechanic will do an annual inspection, do a compression check, and unless the compression is really horrible, he won't even stick a borescope in the cylinder, which strikes me as being malpractice, frankly, because we can see so many incipient issues with the borescope if you just would take the time to take a look inside. To borescope an engine once the spark plugs have been removed, which they typically always are at annual inspection, adds maybe 30 minutes to the process, and it's really quite invaluable, I think. But it's amazing the degree to which we're able to pinpoint problems by analyzing engine monitor data. It's a very, very rich source of data about what's going on in the hot section of the engine when it's operating. And we publish a what we call a flight test profile, which is about a 20-minute set of maneuvers that we like to see our clients do a couple of times a year, particularly shortly before the airplane's going to go in for annual inspection, because it generates a very, very rich stream of data that we're able to use to diagnose various maladies. Basically, the flight test profile consists of two sections. One section is a series of mixture sweeps where the mixture control, the plane is in cruise flight, and we ask that the mixture control be cycled very, very slowly from a very rich mixture to an extremely lean mixture and back again a few times. And those mixture sweeps gives us the ability to determine the mixture distribution of the engine, find out whether there are any, dirty fuel injectors, any induction system leaks, that sort of thing. Then the other thing we ask people to do as part of the flight test profile is an in-flight mag check in cruise with a lean mixture, preferably a lean peak mixture, and to do the mag check very, very slowly. So you switch to one mag, you leave it there for 10 or 15 seconds, then you go back to both, then you go to the other mag for 10 or 15 seconds and back to both. That gives us enough sampling times to be able to really look at the condition of the ignition system. We can detect, marginal spark plugs, marginal ignition leads, mistimed mags. That way we can really get a very good view of what the ignition system is doing. So we publish that flight test profile on our website, and we ask our clients to go through that. It's something you can do on a regular cross-country flight. You don't have to do a special flight for it.
Sure.
But to just do a couple of mixture sweeps and do a couple of slow in-flight mag checks, all while the aircraft is in cruise configuration, and then submit that data to us, and we can really we can learn a tremendous amount about what's going on. And a lot of the modern engine monitors let us monitor a lot of stuff other than the engine. We can get a really good look at the electrical system and how the alternator and regulator is working. A lot of the engine monitors have air data inputs to them, have GPS coordinates being recorded, all sorts of stuff. In fact, a lot of the experimental stuff that has Dynon engine monitors, we even get yaw, pitch, and roll information captured on the engine monitor data, and we've been asked to do analysis of that stuff when there have been aircraft accidents. So this is turning out to be a very, very powerful diagnostic tool.
And Wally, I think you've used this service for that a couple times on your own aircraft, correct?
Yeah, I do.
Well, let's run through a couple questions, and we'll try and give you some of your time back today, Mike. What do you think the biggest flight instructor systems shortcoming is that would obviously help maintenance in the world of flight training?
Well, it's kind of interesting because I mentioned earlier when we were chatting that my fiance is just starting flight training, and so I've had the experience in the last couple of weeks of hanging around the airport with flight instructors in her flight school, who are all very dedicated, very, very young. And I've been really quite interested as somebody who's been flying for 55 years, and these guys have, very, very little real world experience. And I don't get the sense that they really understand the equipment that well. I didn't really understand the hardware in my airplanes until I started doing owner preventive maintenance on my airplane years ago, because the first 20 years or so that I was an aircraft owner, I never swung a wrench on the airplane, and when I started doing my own oil changes and stuff, I started learning a lot more about the hardware. And then, of course, ultimately, I did enough maintenance on the airplane that I was able to qualify for an A&P. But I always encourage aircraft owners to consider doing their own preventive maintenance, because I think it's a fabulous learning experience for owners. And I also encourage them to do at least one owner-assisted annual where they participate in the process of the annual inspection. There's nothing like that to actually get to see every system of your airplane and to get to see the condition of it, not just by looking at some discrepancy list that a mechanic wrote up, but actually to see all this stuff with your own eyes, be walking around. I actually encourage owners to offer to hold the clipboard while the IA is inspecting the airplane, and write down the squawks as he identifies them, because it really gets them involved in that process. And it's one of the most fabulous learning experiences that I know of to do that sort of thing. But I did not get the impression hanging around the local flight school here that the instructors had any real deep knowledge of the equipment at all. They were basically appliance operators, and kind of reminiscent of how I was when I first started flying. But I don't know how you can remedy that in a flight school with your flight instructors, except maybe give them an opportunity to spend some time in the maintenance facility, but particularly maybe while one of the airplanes that they fly is going through annual inspection, so that they can get to see what the world looks like on the other side of the toolbox,
Yeah, I like that. And maybe somehow we can video or partake in some way of recording some of it, just so people can see it when they start and get it as early in their career as possible. You talked about a number of good tips for aircraft owners, participating in annuals, etc. Is there anything else that you think owners do that shoot themselves in the foot over and over again as it relates to maintenance?
Well, again, I think the best thing an aircraft owner can do with regard to maintenance is to try to get involved in the process and educate themselves. Under the FARs, it is the owner of the aircraft that's responsible for keeping it in airworthy condition. But most owners, sort of abdicate that to the mechanics and let the mechanics make all the decisions for them. And I don't think that's a good idea. I think owners need to get more involved and more hands-on. That's why I'm a big fan of owners going through at least one owner-assisted annual, so that they really understand what the whole annual inspection process is about, and why I encourage owners to do as much of their own preventive maintenance as their time and aptitude allows, because it gives them an opportunity to get up close and personal with the hardware. A lot of airplanes nowadays are so tightly cowled that, the pre-flight inspection of the airplane consists of making sure that the oil cap is secured, and that's about all you can see. Some airplanes that's not true of. If you have a Bonanza, they've got those big barn door cowlings where you can actually see something. But an awful lot of airplanes, you can't even really look at the engine without taking the top cowling off. And so, I consider an owner performed oil change as being like advanced pre-flight, where they actually get to lay eyeballs on the engine and see if there are any exhaust leaks or oil leaks or fuel leaks or something that's charring or something that's not secured properly. all stuff that you'd really like to be able to look for during pre-flight, but so many of our airplanes you really can't see very much.
Well, we appreciate your time, Mike. Thank you so much for giving our listeners a peek into your world and all things maintenance, leaning, TBO. I'm sure we could talk for hours more, and maybe we'll ask you to come back, and hopefully you will allow us to have you.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. And thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed talking to you.
And Mike has so much content out on YouTube. I know my daughter has her students watching his YouTube videos on leaning. It's very intuitive, and it's actually very, very listener friendly. It makes just a whole lot of sense.
If you want to see more of what Mike does, check out SavvyAviation.com. Listen to his podcast, Ask the AMPs on AOPA. Both can be found if you go to SavvyAviation.com. And support Mike on Patreon. You get some autographed books and some other inside material from Mike and the guys at Savvy Aviation. Again, Mike, thanks for joining us, and stay behind the props.
My pleasure, guys. Thank you.
Thanks for checking out the Behind the Prop podcast. Be sure to click subscribe and check us out online at BehindTheProp.com. Behind the Prop is recorded in Houston, Texas. Creator and host is Bobby Doss. Co-host is Wally Mulhern. The show is for entertainment purposes only and is not meant to replace actual flight instruction. Thanks for listening, and remember, fly safe.